Small businesses, do you know who we don't spend a ton of time thinking about? The Department of Justice. We're going to change that today because my colleague Laura and I are going to talk about some changes that have happened with a recent DOJ ruling about website accessibility. So my name is Erica Dickstein and I'm with Spring Insight.
Laura Mayer, also with Spring Insight.
So we're going to talk today, Laura, about a recent ruling, as I said, from the Department of Justice. Can you start us out by telling us who is the Department of Justice and why are we talking about them today?
How do we care about them? The Department of Justice, or the DOJ, is a federal entity that's responsible for enforcing laws and ensuring justice within the United States. So we kind of think about that in three buckets, if you will. They're responsible for criminal prosecution. So that would be in situations of public corruption or organized crime, something like that. We also think about the DOJ and enforcing consumer protection laws, so like antitrust laws or any fraudulent practices in the healthcare industry or sectors such as that. And then also the DOJ comes into play for civil rights enforcement. So the Fair Housing Act is something the DOJ pays attention to. Also, ADA compliance, the American Disabilities Act compliance. This is where that comes into play.
Got it. So if we're thinking ADA, probably most of us are thinking about handrails, stair options, et cetera, et cetera. But here we're talking about something a little different, right?
Right. And when the ADA came about, it was enacted in 1990, and it was talking about access to public spaces. And there was no internet back then so much, right? We didn't have websites and applications like we do today. And so in those days, the ADA did refer to physical entrance for everyone into buildings and whatnot. But the actual goal of the ADA is to prohibit discrimination at large against individuals with disabilities in public life. So that was in our physical environment in 1990, but here in 2024, we also have that digital environment. We now have the library website where you go and download your book, right? We have the ability to purchase public transportation or call public transportation through different apps. We can see our taxes or pay our tax bill, these sorts of things. So it was really a beautiful law that encompassed an area that wasn't even really developed yet, but it is so now. And Title II is specifically of the ADA is what applies to website owners because it says that any state or local government entities or organizations doing work with them must be accessible.
Yeah, that's such a great point. Whereas in the past, you would have been able to live your entire life in that sort of more physical realm. Now that we have to live in this digital realm, of course, it makes absolute sense that the ADA needs to be expansive of these places online for people to be able to navigate and to do that same business that they wouldn't necessarily walk into the office to do. So let's shift a little bit and talk about like what that looks like. So what are the kinds of things that are going to be included in an ADA compliant website?
Yeah, that's a great point. A good question too. So the DOJ is going to look towards what's called the WCAG 2.1 AA level compliance. Okay, so what's that? The WCAG is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and they were created by the World Wide Web Consortium, the W3C, the World Wide Web people. And what it aims to do specifically is to provide a better user experience for people with disabilities. There's a level A, which is very basic. AA is the catch-all that we're shooting for. And then there's actually also AAA compliance, and those have some very, very, very specific things. AA is middle of the road, and that's what we shoot for in our typical website development and applications. In a nutshell, we could get into the specifics and the nitty gritty of all that, but it basically ensures that web content adheres to an acronym called POUR, P-O-U-R. Is it perceivable? Is it operable? Is it understandable? And is it robust? And different bits to ensure that the user interface accounts for all of those attributes as well.
Awesome. That is a good way of looking at it. And I like, it makes me feel better that they're just having us aim for mediocrity, right? Just
Yeah.
just the middle of the road. So, if I so tell us a little bit more now about the DOJ mandate, about specifically what, when do we have to comply with this by, who needs to comply, et cetera, et cetera.
So let's start with who needs to comply. Any organization that is doing work with a state or local or any kind of government entity, any organization working with an entity that provides services also needs to be compliant. So if you're a crime contractor, of course, all of your digital environments need to be accessible. But if you're also a subcontractor to that crime, your digital space also needs to be compliant. Yes. Now we talked about timeline.
It's very. I think of it as an octopus. It's got a lot of tentacles that you can that reach out to a lot of things.
Yes, yeah. What it all boils down to is just be compliant, just become accessible, make your life easier. But your question was the timing of it. So it is a little bit different based on the population of the population served by that entity. I think, and don't quote me on this one, if it's 50,000 or less, you have close to 2 years to become compliant. If you're working with a population greater than 50,000, you have about a year to become compliant.
Mm-hmm.
This is a good amount of time. It's not a lot of time.
Right.
So we should probably talk remediation, right? What does remediation mean? You want to talk about that? Well,
yeah. So remediation means basically taking existing builds of sites, taking existing existing work and retrofitting it to make it compliant. So whether that's making sure that changing existing colors to make sure that the contrast is appropriate, adding in whatever kind of tab structure that you need to be able to navigate it properly. There's remediation and then there's rebuild. Since it's a little bit longer, I'm going to say rebuilding tends to be that's where you sort of start over. In a lot of ways, it sounds counterintuitive to say that rebuilding something is a bit easier. If you've built a database that has a depth of information, that it's probably rebuilding may not be, but it may not be as easy. But on the other hand, if you're talking about websites or lighter applications, rebuilding actually in some ways might be easier because the problem with remediation is it can be kind of finicky, right? It's already existing. It's almost like, if you think about renovating your house versus redoing your house. In some ways, redoing it and starting over can be a little bit easier, and you know that you're going to get the result that's closer to what you want.
Yeah, good point. If the plumbing and electrical, if the retrograde is too expensive, sometimes it's just easier to start over, or
Yeah,
to address your content and make some other changes and bring them all together.
that's such a great way of looking at it, actually. I'm going to go with what you said and say, like, if you think about the plumbing and the electric, they're in the walls, right? Like when you're rebuilding something, you are taking down the walls. You are now putting in the new pipes and the new electric. That's a lot easier than digging out the walls to try and get that. So okay, let's talk about why you should care.
Okay.
Why should an organization care about this? And we can and probably will do an entire video about this, but let's touch at least lightly on, if somebody has watched through this entire video, why do they care?
Yeah, well, number one is, in no particular order, legal compliance. There are people that will spend the better part of their day looking for non-compliant websites and will sue you, right? And you have the expense of being sued, going to court, and you'll probably lose too. Even if you don't lose, as we were talking about earlier, Erica, there's still the expense of legally representing yourself in a situation. So
Yeah, it's absolutely true. I mean, these are, it's a class of opportunistic attorney that literally that's what they do is they search for sites who are non-compliant so that they can take them to court. Um,
yeah,
whether win or lose, that's just not a headache that an organization would like to deal with.
yeah, and I would back to what we were talking about earlier too. Is I would, if I were an organization considering remediation or a rebuild, those were cost and a risk that has to be considered of. If you don't do it, how much will you spend fighting off legal matters?
Absolutely
So
excellent
that's number
point.
one. Number two, or in again, no particular order, right? It's just to be inclusive and accessible. It's why wouldn't you want the most amount of users possible to ingest your information, to use your applications? It's just morally and ethically the right thing to do.
And one of the latest statistics that I'm seeing on this is that something like 20% of the US population
Yeah.
has some sort of disability of some sort. And this is the point where I point out that I wear reading glasses. I did not used to, but I do now. And so as somebody who wears reading glasses, that means that, I am using I'm not going to do well if you have light gray text on a dark gray background. I am going to struggle with that. And why would you want to make me or somebody else struggle when you come to your website?
Yeah. Oh, we see that quite a bit. Remember the trend of the white fonts on like the bright background, the yellow, which looks great design wise if you don't have any issues. But if you have issues, it's absolutely unreadable. We
Absolutely.
don't think about.
I remember a certain brand that catered. It was very popular a number of years ago that catered to the teenage market that had, kid you not, mid-gray font on slightly lighter mid-gray background, and I always thought that it was literally made because they were targeting a young demographic, and older people they did not want older people to use them. They also had signage that was absolutely cutting over to, wonder if anybody can guess what brand I'm talking about now. But with that, why don't we switch over to best practices and benefits?
Yeah, and that's definitely a really good reason too. A lot of the initiatives that one almost every application takes to make fair information more accessible actually strengthens the technical health and optimization scores of the website and application itself. So there are things again that typical user doesn't know about necessarily or understand, that it's the things in the back end and in the code that make the website run smoother, um, help it be more accessible by the search bots, are the same items that make it more accessible for people who use assisted technology when accessing that information.
Absolutely, both on the back end, by the way, and on the front end also with the design. Just like we were talking about, the universal design is called universal design because it is what is best for everybody. So such a great point and a really good place, I think, for us to close out and to tell everybody. So if you think, your organization that you possibly should have a compliant website, we're happy to take a look at your site and let you know whether your site is compliant and to help you figure out what your requirement to do so is. So if you visit our website, the website URL is going to be below in the description, but it's spring, like the season, insight.com. And in addition, if you've enjoyed this video, I hope that you will subscribe so that you get alerts when we put out more fantastic content.